In a laboratory in Bologna, a geneticist stared at a screen and said one word: impossible. A skeleton pulled from Sicilian soil didn't match what anyone expected. Not Italian, not Greek, not even fully European. For centuries, Sicily has been called the most conquered island on earth. Greeks, Carthaginians, Romans, Vandals, Arabs, Normans, Spaniards, all of them left something behind. But when scientists finally cracked open the DNA of the Sicilian people, the answer to who are they really turned out to be stranger, older, and far more surprising than anyone in Palermo or in a DNA testing lab in America ever expected. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll know exactly which ethnicity Sicilian blood is really closest to, and it is not who you think. Sicily sits at the exact center of the Mediterranean Sea, closer to Tunisia than to Rome. For over 3,000 years, that single fact made it one of the most fought-over pieces of land in human history. Every great power that ever wanted to control the Mediterranean had to control Sicily first. Which means the story of Sicilian DNA isn't really the story of one people. It's the story of every people who ever crossed that sea. But here's the question that keeps coming up, from genealogy forums to university genetics departments. When you strip away the myths, the folklore, the assumptions people make from a suntan or a surname who are Sicilians actually, biologically closest to, they're fellow Italians on the mainland, the Greeks who colonized their coasts, the North Africans across the water, or something else entirely, something buried thousands of years before any of those civilizations existed. Long before Greek ships ever touched Sicilian shores, the island already had people on it. Ancient writers spoke of three native peoples, the Sicani, the Elymians, and the Sicels, the very group whose name would eventually become Sicily itself. Genetic research on skeletal remains shows these early populations descended from the same Neolithic farmers who spread across the Mediterranean from Anatolia thousands of years earlier, layered on top of even older hunter-gatherer ancestry that had lived on the island since the last ice age. This is the foundation, the bedrock layer of Sicilian ancestry, and it's a foundation shared with nearly every population in southern Europe. Which means before a single Greek temple was built, before a single Carthaginian trading post appeared, Sicily's genetic story was already deeply, fundamentally European and Mediterranean. Remember that detail. It matters more than almost anything else in this story because everything that happens next is often assumed to have erased it. It didn't. Starting around the 8th century BCE, Greek colonists arrived in massive numbers, founding cities like Syracuse, Akragas, and Gela that became wealthier and more magnificent than many cities in Greece itself. So many Greeks settled here that ancient writers started calling Sicily and southern Italy Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. At the same time, Phoenician and later Carthaginian settlers controlled the western half of the island, creating a genetic and cultural fault line that ran straight down the middle of Sicily for centuries. Then came Rome, absorbing the island as its very first overseas province. Then Vandals. Then the Byzantine Empire, ruling for nearly 300 years. By the early medieval period, Sicily's population was already one of the most layered, blended populations anywhere in Europe. And yet, here's the twist, almost nobody expects none of these groups, not even the Greeks who colonized so heavily, turned out to be the closest genetic match to modern Sicilians. The truth was still one chapter away. In 831 AD, Arab and Berber forces from North Africa began conquering Sicily, eventually ruling the island for over 200 years. This period transformed Sicilian agriculture, architecture, and cuisine so profoundly that its fingerprints are still visible today, in citrus groves, in the word Sicily for certain foods, in place names across the island. And because of this, a popular belief spread, one repeated endlessly online, that Sicilians are genetically closer to North Africans than to other Europeans. It sounds plausible. It fits the dramatic history. But population geneticists who have actually sequenced Sicilian DNA have found something almost the opposite is true. The Arab and North African genetic contribution to the modern Sicilian gene pool, according to multiple published autosomal studies, is measurable but small, typically estimated in the range of just a few percentage points for most Sicilians, not the dominant ancestry many assume. Which means the answer to our central question is still hiding in plain sight, and it's about to get much more specific. So, here is what large-scale genetic studies, including research published on Mediterranean and Italian population structure, actually reveal. Modern Sicilians cluster most tightly, genetically, with two groups above all others: mainland southern Italians, especially Calabrians and people from Puglia, and secondly, mainland Greeks. On population genetic charts, Sicilians sit almost directly between southern mainland Italy and the Greek peninsula, forming a tight Mediterranean cluster distinct from northern Italians, distinct from North Africans, and distinct from the Middle East. In other words, the deep Neolithic and Bronze Age layer we talked about earlier, the one laid down before any invasion, was never erased. It was reinforced, again and again, by populations that were themselves closely related to it. Every wave that arrived Greek, Roman, even much of the Norman and Arab period migration came from populations that shared deep ancestral roots with the people already living there. Sicily wasn't overwritten, it was deepened. But there's one more twist worth telling. In 1061, Norman knights from France invaded Sicily, and within 30 years controlled the entire island, founding a kingdom famous for uniting Latin, Greek, and Arab culture under one crown. Genetically, the direct Norman contribution turned out to be small. A relatively brief ruling elite doesn't reshape an island's DNA the way 3,000 years of Mediterranean settlement does. Numbers matter more than the number of years of ruling. A small conquering class leaves a cultural legacy, churches, laws, architecture, long before it leaves a genetic one. So, after every empire, every invasion, every myth, what is the honest, evidence-based answer? Sicilians are closest, genetically, to other southern Italians, Calabrians, Apulians, and Campanians, and closely related to mainland Greeks, reflecting thousands of years of shared Mediterranean ancestry going back to the earliest farming populations of the region. North African, Near Eastern, and other more distant influences are real, measurable, and historically fascinating. But they are minority threads woven into a Mediterranean tapestry, not the dominant pattern. The people who conquered Sicily most dramatically were not always the people who shaped it most genetically. History and biology, it turns out, don't always tell the same story. Sicily was never conquered into becoming something else. It absorbed every empire that touched it, and remained, at its core, exactly what it always was: one of the oldest, deepest bloodlines in the Mediterranean world. If this surprised you, imagine what the DNA of Sicily's neighbors might reveal. Subscribe, because that's exactly where we're going next.